Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's going on in Iran because you may have seen press reports that there is unrest in Iran. There's been actually around 6 or 7 days of rioting and protests in the country, and it's reported that multiple people have now died, most of them protesters, well, I think all of them protesters. But it's very difficult in terms of getting a full story because there's limited coverage of what's happening in Iran. But I wanted to go through what's going on and talk about what's happening in the economy because Iran actually has the fourth largest oil reserves in the world. So the only countries with more reserves are Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Canada. So you would imagine that Iran should be a really wealthy country, but it isn't anywhere near as wealthy as it should be. It ranks around about 25th in terms of global GDP. And the main reason for that is because of the sanctions that are in place. It's actually one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world. And these sanctions date back for a long period of time. The USA first sanctioned Iran back in 1979. But the big wave of sanctions came around 2007 when it was discovered that Iran had been enriching its nuclear program. It basically had taken it well beyond where you need to enrich uranium to use it in a nuclear power plant. That's generally speaking around 15 or 20%. Iran was seen to be enriching it to maybe 50, 60, 70%, which is moving towards weapons grade. So that was the reason why the big wave of sanctions came in. And we're talking about the USA, the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Norway. So basically, most of the countries that have sanctioned Russia have already sanctioned Iran. So Iran's been struggling to be able to find buyers for its oil for a long period of time. But you might not be surprised to hear that China and Russia and India and Turkey have not sanctioned Iran. So they've actually been the biggest buyers of Iranian oil. Well, maybe Russia hasn't been buying that much Iranian oil because they've got more oil than they know what to do with already. But the reason for the latest protests is down to what's happening with inflation and the exchange rate. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation in Iran over the past 12 months. And one thing to note here, really important, is that the scale on the right-hand side does not start at zero. It actually starts at 30%. So you can see just the first initial takeaway is that inflation has been above 30% throughout the whole of the last 12 months. So it's already extremely high. That's higher than has been seen in most economies ever. But if you look at what's been happening in 2025, you can see that there's been a ramping up in inflation. And the most recent data, which was published for October, that's the latest that we have so far, shows that inflation was almost up at 50%. And if I widen the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 5 years, you can see the problem here, that the scale again here starts at 30% at the bottom. So in the last 5 years, inflation has been running consistently above 30%. But as you can see, for a lot of the time, it's been up above 40%, and in some months, it's been up above 50%. And as we've talked about in previous videos, when you've got year on year on year inflation, that really destroys the value of the money in your pocket. If you've got 30% inflation in 1 year, if we take an example, just very, very brief example, if a product was priced at $1, 30% inflation, roughly speaking, would mean that in 12 months' time, that product would be priced at $1.30. If you then had another 30% inflation on top of that, that's going to be taking it up to around $1.70. And then in the third year, it's going to be above $2. And by year 5, you're looking at a product that was previously priced at $1 being costing you somewhere in the region of $3 or $4. So you can start to see how inflation really starts to damage the purchasing power of the money in your pockets. So that's what's going on with regards to inflation. If we have a quick look at food inflation, which we always like to keep an eye on because it tells us what's happening with the poorest members of society, which I think when you're looking at the protests that are going on in Iran at the moment, it tends to be people who are potentially starving who decide that they need to go out and make a point of this. You can see that with food inflation, the situation is actually worse. So the shape of this chart over the past 12 months is very similar to what we just looked at for general inflation. But the latest data shows that food inflation in September, we don't have the figure for October, it wasn't published, was almost 60%. So that's a lot higher than general inflation. If we widen the scale of this chart, you can see it's basically the same story as we've just looked at, but the numbers are higher. This chart shows the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Iranian rial over the past 12 months. And this is a currency which has got a sort of comical exchange rate, because if we look back over the past 12 months, you can see that a year ago, one US dollar was trading for 800,000 Iranian rials. Today, it's trading for 1.35 million. So one US dollar is 1.35 million rials. So this is one of the reasons why you hear about countries actually devaluing their currency to bring it back into line with what's going on with its exchange rate, because you don't really want a currency whereby you're having to get 1.35 million of them to buy something that's valued at $1, because obviously if you're buying something more expensive, you're buying something that's hundreds of dollars, then you're going to be into tens of millions of reals. So it sort of makes a mockery of the currency when you've got it at that level. If you become a billionaire, it doesn't actually mean that much if everything costs a million plus. But the point of showing you this chart is really just to have a look at what's been happening to the relative value, the purchasing power of the currency. So over the last 12 months, we have seen a devaluation of over 65%. So that's bad in itself. But if we look at what's happened in the last 6 months, the currency is down by more than 50% in 6 months. And in the past month, it's down by 12%. And one of the problems that this causes, when you've got such a rapid and continued depreciation of your currency, it means that prices are constantly going up, because Iran is a net importer, imports food. It doesn't produce enough food to feed the population. So a lot of the goods that shopkeepers are buying have been imported. And so the price of those goods has to be adjusted pretty much every single day. So if you go to the store, you're going to see a new price for all of the different products every single day. And that's one of the reasons why these protests started recently, was because the shopkeepers in Iran basically had enough. So they started closing their bazaars, basically saying, okay, we're not opening for business because I don't want to have to keep increasing my prices by 2 or 3 or 4% every single day that I open, because it's causing problems with the customers. People are coming in with their millions of rials to buy a loaf of bread and finding that the price has gone up by another 3 or 4% since yesterday. So those sorts of conditions are not sustainable. So the shopkeepers closed down their shops, started protesting. Interestingly, the Iranian authorities, and we've got a supreme leader in Iran. I'm not sure whether you know the political situation, but they have a supreme leader. And then they have, beneath that, they've also got a president. So the supreme leader is the main guy, though. Anyway, in response to the recent protests, the authorities actually announced a national holiday. So whilst all the shops were closing, they suddenly said, okay, there's now a national holiday. And the reason why they said they were having that is because the weather was too cold, which is the first time I've ever heard of a public holiday being declared because it's too cold. Maybe you know of one. If you do, then drop me a comment. But in terms of looking at the economic situation, this is what's been happening with interest rates in Iran over the past 5 years. So you can see that 5 years ago, interest rates were sitting at 18%. They've only been increased once in 2023. They're now sitting at 23%. Now, obviously, 23% is a very high rate of interest. But as I said, Iran's not really operating like a capitalist economy. So people aren't borrowing a lot of money. So I don't think the interest rate is actually having that big a bearing on people's lives. Now, in terms of the balance of trade, unfortunately, the data that we get is horribly out of date. So the most recent figures that are available are the end of 2024. We're now in 2026, so this is more than a year old. But the reason why I wanted to show you this chart is just to highlight the fact that Iran is a net importer. So you can see the zero line, which is roughly around about halfway up this graph. And since 2022, Iran has been paying more for its imports than it's been earning from its exports. So it's a net importer, and one of the biggest items that it's importing is food. So this is a problem for both consumers and also for inflation. Now, one thing that they do have an abundance of is gasoline. So I thought it was worth having a look at what's going on with gasoline prices, because this is actually one of the things that is updated constantly. So you can see that in the past 12 months, there has been no movement in gasoline prices in Iran. You can buy a litre of gasoline for 36 US dollar cents equivalent. I don't know what that is in the local currency. It's going to be a big number because $1 equates to 1.35 million rials. And if we expand the scale of this chart to show the last 10 years, you can see the gasoline prices are not the problem in Iran at the moment in terms of what's driving up inflation. Now, just before we go on any further today, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscriber button? And also, I wanted to remind you that I'm currently running my competition whereby you can win either my beach house located close to one of the best beaches in the whole of the UK. It's a bit of fun. It's another way of funding the channel. So if you'd like to do that, then have a look at this QR code on the screen now. It'll take you straight through to the independent company that's hosting this for me. You can buy tickets for £5 each. And if you're not interested in my house, then you can have a cash alternative prize of £250,000 in any currency that you would like. So please have a look at that if you'd like to support the channel. And this chart shows the amount of oil that Iran is producing on a daily basis, measured in millions of barrels of oil, dating back over the last 10 years. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart goes from 2 million barrels at the bottom to 4 million barrels at the top. So you can see that currently Iran is producing around about 3.2 million barrels of oil per day. And that's actually been increasing quite significantly over the past few years. Back in the COVID pandemic, it was obviously down to around 2 million barrels, which most countries did cut back on their production. And you can see that prior to the pandemic, it was actually producing around 3.8. So the current levels of production are quite a lot lower than they were in the past. And that's because the sanctions have been increased. So it's not just direct sanctions on the oil itself, it's also financial and banking and all of the sanctions that we're very familiar with when we're talking about Russia, how the West has made it very difficult for Russia to actually do any trade with countries, because it's not just if the oil tanker itself is moving sanctioned oil, you can actually trace it through the banking system. And the same secondary sanctions that apply with regards to Russia also apply to Iran. So countries have to be very careful when they're buying Iranian oil. And quite a lot of Iranian oil is transported and moved ship to ship. So you can do those mid-ocean transfers where it basically masks the origin of where that oil has come from. But the fact that Iran is the fourth largest country in the world in terms of oil reserves, this is a disappointing level of production. It's down to the sanctions. And that's one of the reasons why there is economic hardship in Iran at the moment. Because of the sanctions have been in place for such a long time, it's now impacting on all of those imports. It's pushed the cost of imports up. It's destroyed the value of the currency. There is a lot of black market usage in Iran. So people are happier using things like the US dollar if they can get their hands on it, because when you've got your currency constantly declining, high rates of inflation and high interest costs, then it means that people really don't want to be holding their wealth in the local currency. But this is a problem that we've seen in many other countries. It's very difficult to fix, because how do you get away from it until you break away from the sanctions? So interestingly, one of the reasons why the sanctions were put into place is because Iran was developing its nuclear capabilities. It was enriching the uranium. However, back in June, those facilities were destroyed by Israel, who sent over bombers, and they used bombs that were authorized by the USA. They had these bunker buster bombs, which can break through levels of rock, because these facilities are actually buried beneath rock, so quite difficult to hit. Only the USA have those bombs that had the capability to break into the facilities. They did that and were told that those nuclear enrichment facilities have now been destroyed. So Iran isn't actually capable of continuing to enrich its uranium. But I don't think the sanctions are going to be lifted anytime soon. But I wanted to post this video really just to give you an update as to what's happening in Iran, talk to you about what the economy looks like. It's very different to a capitalist economy. It's very controlled by the state, so interest rates don't really move. They're in control of what's happening, but unfortunately, they're not in control of inflation. It's been taking off. That's destroyed the value of the Iranian rial, and people are now getting very unhappy about this because the cost of living is soaring. It's becoming more and more expensive to put food on the table for normal Iranians. So the fact that they're protesting, I think, really shows the level of the problem in the country right now, because protests are not well received by the authorities. People have died already, and if these protests carry on, then it's likely that the situation is going to deteriorate and get worse. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm running my competition where you can win my house or £250,000. So if you're interested in that, have a look at the QR code on the screen now. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee, sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a patron, YouTube member, or buy me a coffee member, really, really appreciate that support. Genuinely mean that. I know I've said it in most videos, but I genuinely mean it. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.